Colombia in the 1990s was a country torn apart by violence. Guerrilla warfare, paramilitary groups, drug cartels, kidnappings, and poverty left scars across the land. Death was a daily statistic. But even in a place where violence was expected, where families lived with the constant shadow of bloodshed, one man's crimes would emerge as something uniquely monstrous. His name was Luis Alfredo Garavito, and he would be remembered as La Bestia, the Beast. Between 1992 and 1999, Garavito lured, tortured, and murdered at least 138 boys, though investigators believe the true number may have been over 200. He targeted the poorest, the most vulnerable, the children no one searched for, the boys already forgotten by a world too busy surviving. His story is not only one of staggering cruelty, but also of a society so fractured that a predator was allowed to thrive in its cracks. Luis Alfredo Garavito was born in 1957 in Quindío, a region known for its coffee plantations and rural poverty. His childhood was marked by brutality. His father was a violent alcoholic who beat him relentlessly. His mother showed him little affection, and the home was filled with chaos. From an early age, Luis was molested by neighbors and older men, experiences that twisted his developing psyche. He grew up without safety, without love, without stability. Teachers recalled a boy who was restless, prone to violent outbursts and unable to concentrate. He was bullied for wearing glasses and for his nervous, awkward demeanor. By adolescence, he had developed a deep hatred of himself, of others, of the innocence he had lost. He dropped out of school, drifting through odd jobs, already drinking heavily, already lost. By his 20s, Garavito was an alcoholic, unemployed, and unable to form lasting relationships. He moved from town to town, blending into Colombia's shifting landscape. To most people, he seemed pathetic rather than threatening, a man beaten down by life. But behind his thick glasses and nervous smile, darker urges were festering. He fantasized about young boys, particularly those between the ages of 8 and 16. They reminded him of himself, vulnerable and powerless. But in his fantasies, he was no longer the victim. He was the one in control. Colombia in the 1990s was filled with displaced children. Civil war and poverty drove thousands into the streets. Boys as young as 8 begged for food, shined shoes, or sold candy at bus stations. Many were orphans, others had fled abusive homes. To Garavito, they were the perfect victims, hungry, trusting, alone, invisible. He developed a method of hunting them that was chillingly effective. He disguised himself as a friendly man of authority or opportunity. Sometimes he posed as a monk, wearing a brown robe. Other times he dressed as a farmer, a street vendor, or even a charity worker. He carried small gifts, candy, toys, coins, and promised food, shelter, or work. To a hungry boy, his offer seemed like salvation. Once the child agreed to follow him, Garavito would lead him away from crowded streets, down dirt paths, into fields, wooded areas, or abandoned buildings. There, the mask of kindness would fall. The torture that followed was beyond comprehension. Garavito bound the boys, forced them to endure hours of sexual assault, and subjected them to sadistic violence. He often mutilated them, stabbing or cutting, sometimes gouging out eyes or castrating them. Finally, he would strangle or stab them to death, leaving their broken bodies in shallow graves or underbrush. Many were found naked, bound, and bearing signs of horrific abuse. Investigators would later describe his crimes as among the most sadistic they had ever encountered. For years, these murders went unnoticed as a pattern. Colombia's violence masked them. Dead bodies were common. Missing boys were assumed to have joined guerrillas, paramilitaries, or gangs. Families were too poor or too powerless to press for answers. Police forces, underfunded and overwhelmed, rarely connected the dots. Garavito moved from town to town, killing with impunity. He later admitted he killed at least 172 boys, though only 138 were confirmed. He claimed he could not stop, that his urges consumed him. He called it a compulsion, a need that grew stronger each time he killed. By the mid-1990s, however, investigators began to notice patterns. In regions like Quindío, Risaralda, and Valle del Cauca, boys were disappearing in alarming numbers. Their bodies, when found, bore the same horrific signs: bound, assaulted, mutilated, killed. The victims were always poor boys, usually between 8 and 14. The killings often occurred near schools, bus stations, or marketplaces. Slowly, the threads began to weave into a picture of a serial predator. In 1997, a mass grave was discovered near Pereira. Dozens of boys' remains were found, each showing signs of torture and sexual assault. The scale of the horror could no longer be ignored. Police launched a massive investigation, one of the largest in Colombian history. The public, already numbed by daily violence, was stunned by the revelation that a single man could be responsible for so many deaths. The breakthrough came in 1999, when a young boy narrowly escaped Garavito's clutches and alerted authorities. Around the same time, police found glasses at one of the crime scenes, thick, unusual lenses that matched Garavito's prescription. Witnesses described a man with glasses, middle-aged, sometimes posing as a charity worker. The net began to close. Garavito was arrested later that year. Under interrogation, he broke. Perhaps exhausted, perhaps eager to unburden himself, he confessed in chilling detail. He admitted to killing over 170 boys, describing how he lured them, how he bound them, how he tortured them, how he watched them die. He spoke of it with disturbing calm, even pride at times, as though recounting a terrible compulsion that had defined his life. He led investigators to burial sites where remains of his victims were found. The full scale of his crimes stunned even hardened detectives. In 1999, Garavito was convicted of 138 murders. His sentence under Colombian law was 1,853 years in prison, the longest ever given in the country. Yet because Colombian law capped maximum sentences, he could serve no more than 40 years, later reduced for cooperation. The idea that a man who murdered more than 100 children might one day walk free horrified the public. Reforms were later passed to prevent such leniency, but for the families of victims, the damage was done. Psychologists and criminologists studied Garavito extensively. He was classified as a psychopath, incapable of empathy, driven by sadistic sexual urges. Some suggested his abusive childhood created a cycle of violence. Others argued he was simply evil, a man who chose cruelty. Garavito himself admitted he could not stop. Killing was not just compulsion, it was satisfaction. He said he felt a release only when his victims suffered and died. The legacy of his crimes is unbearable to contemplate. More than 100 families lost their sons. Hundreds of boys, each with a name, a face, a future, were reduced to statistics. They were the poorest, the most forgotten, children who deserved protection but found only betrayal. Colombia, a nation already drowning in blood, was forced to confront a horror unlike any other. Not a warlord, not a cartel assassin, but a single man. A predator who stalked children in daylight and killed them with unimaginable cruelty. Today, Garavito remains in prison, reviled as La Bestia. His name is spoken with disgust, his crimes remembered as among the worst in history. Yet his story lingers as a warning. Monsters are not only born from myths or legends. Sometimes they are men, ordinary in appearance, who exploit poverty, trust, and invisibility to prey on the most vulnerable. Sometimes they thrive because society looks the other way. Luis Alfredo Garavito, La Bestia, killed more children than most wars. He remains a reminder of what happens when silence shields the predator, when the cries of the poor go unheard. His victims were boys whose lives mattered, even if the world treated them as disposable. To remember them is to refuse to let their suffering vanish into statistics. And so, when we tell his story, we tell it not for him, but for them. For the boys who sold flowers in the marketplace, who begged for coins at bus stops, who trusted a man with glasses and a smile, only to find torture and death. Their voices deserve to be heard. Their memory deserves to be honored. Don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Crimson Narratives for more haunting stories from the darkest corners of human history. Because only by remembering can we honor the victims, and only by telling these stories can we hope to guard against the monsters that still walk among us.